The year is 1857, and one of the most influential works in all of literary history, a French realist novel called Madame Bovary, is at the centre of a monumental, controversial, and widely publicised obscenity trial. This scandalous book is about an idealistic, passionate woman who dreams of a life of romance and excitement, only to find herself trapped in a dull marriage, constrained by the harshness of mundane reality in her provincial town, and then turns to adultery to try to find the love she had expected from reading books. In the mid-19th century, this book has been deemed too obscene for readers, and its author, Gustave Flaubert, a pioneering artist in the mode of realism, one of the fathers of the modern novel, and a writer who sought ceaselessly after the perfect word. In the very same year that poet Charles Baudelaire faced prosecution for his Flowers of Evil, Flaubert is being prosecuted for morally corrupting the reading public. And today we are going to discuss why. What was it about this work that caused such scandal? And what was the outcome of that trial? But first, we're going to need to understand some of the revolutionary things that Flaubert was doing with the novel form. And we need to understand why his central protagonist, Emma Bovary, was so confronting to many readers. And to do that, we're going to need to get a sense of what it was like to be a woman in the 19th century in France. We'll also talk about which translation into English is best, why this novel still matters today, and how best to read this controversial masterpiece. And we're doing this because at time of recording, we are now kicking off a brand new exclusive lecture series and read-through for Flaubert's Madame Bovary at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. You can join us on that journey, and you can also instantly access on demand an extensive back catalogue of bookish discussions, lectures and read-throughs for so many of the greatest works ever penned. At the book club, we have befriended so many great writers together, from Shakespeare to Tolstoy, from Dostoevsky to Dickens, from Lady Murasaki to Jane Austen to Virginia Woolf and the Bronte sisters. And we're going to meet many more together over the course of our reading programme this year. At time of recording, we have just wrapped up our deep reading of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude and Ovid's Metamorphoses. And later this year, together, we will be meeting writers like Faulkner, Chaucer, Homer, and many more. But for now, let's break into Flaubert's Madame Bovary, let's meet Emma, and let's begin by setting the stage and talking about realism. So, to really understand the controversy, we have to understand what the landscape of imaginative literature looked like before Flaubert, because we could well divide literary history into two stages, at least when it comes to the novel form: pre and post Flaubert. Indeed, there are three monumental novels that caused seismic shifts when it came to the development of the novel, and they are: number one, Don Quixote by Cervantes; number two, Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert; and number three, Ulysses by James Joyce. And at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we have already read Don Quixote and Ulysses together, so I'm very, very excited that we're now going to be reading Flaubert, and we will have dealt with this trio, this really influential trio. And when you hear the name Flaubert, the term realism is not far behind. Even if you haven't read his works, you probably equate Flaubert with realism. Though the writer himself would contest that description, he would reject such labels, and he would also ultimately see himself as an old romantic. But what is realism? Realism in literature is the artistic decision to depict the everyday, the banal, the mundane, with great truthfulness and fidelity to reality. Especially when it comes to something like social realism, we see that writers want to show the ugly side of life, the ugly side that literature had traditionally covered up, and covered up with idealism. Art has long been seen as a mirror up to nature, though it is always a selective mirror. And the realist artist selects the humdrum and the everyday in service of convincing the reader that there is no selection process going on, that they are just experiencing reality. That's the illusion, that the book we have in our hands is a direct experience of reality. And there's a tension in Flaubert's Madame Bovary and many realist novels, because you've got a writer who's trying valiantly to eschew traditional artistic conventions and artificiality, and yet simultaneously there is an enormous amount of artificiality. You've got great musical and visual harmony in Flaubert's poetic prose. Realism is all about, as Flaubert himself would say, it's all about bringing out the small fact as powerfully as the big fact, the large. It's all about focusing on the minutiae. And so realist works will very often take us to rural locations, and they will introduce us to characters from working class backgrounds or everyday middle class bourgeois backgrounds, rather than taking us into the company of aristocracy or royalty. And it will give us the everyday and the familiar and the mundane rather than the fantastical, which was what books typically had been about. And when we speak of realism, it is ultimately in contrast to romance. You can split the literary tradition into two broad sweeps movements, and there are, of course, offshoots from each of them. But simply put, writers are typically in one camp more than another. They're either more on the romance side of things or the realist side of things. Romance gives us things that couldn't possibly happen. Realism gives us things that very well could happen. Charles Dickens, for example, is more in the romance camp, at least in the first half of his career, with his melodrama and sentimentality. And Victor Hugo is more in the romance camp too, with his relentless idealism. Now, they both have realist elements, but writers do typically have a dominant aesthetic mode. And later this year, we're going to be reading a thoroughly romantic work together to break up our summer reading of the saga that is Homer's Iliad and then the Odyssey. At the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we're going to journey through both of them together. To break up that amazing journey, we're going to be diving in to Alexander Dumas' The Three Musketeers. We already have a lecture series available for the Count of Monte Cristo. He actually wrote both of those books at the same time in 1844. That's a great example of a romance work. Around that time, romance was still enjoying its day in the sun. So together, this year, we're essentially taking two samples from the same locale, from France, because for the novel form, the century, the 19th century, belonged to France. Also England and Russia. We're going to take two writers, Flaubert being a realist representative and Dumas being a romance representative, and we're going to see how they compare. We're going to contrast and compare them together. And in France, the line separating romance and realism runs right down the centre of the century, more or less. Realism had been evolving steadily for a while, but here we feel a shift in reading and writing tastes. And we see time and again when it comes to the great books that social and political revolution precipitates and facilitates aesthetic revolution. We discussed this in depth with our reading of 100 Years of Solitude, and of course if you read Gabriel Garcia Marquez with us, it's going to be incredibly rewarding to go from magical realism back to realism, because the thing about magical realism is it's a blend of the two modes, romance and realism. It keeps the fantastical, but it presents them as though it were mundane reality. Now, this is where things can get a little bit confusing when we're talking about romance, and this is an entire lecture unto itself, an entire series of lectures in fact, and this is one of my favourite things to talk about. If you have enjoyed a few of my videos and podcasts, then you know I absolutely adore the topic of romance versus realism. But when we talk of romance, we typically think of a few different things, or we can think of a few different things. Today, we hear that word and we think love story, don't we? Romance is a love story. If we are lovers of poetry, we think of the Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th century with poets like Wordsworth, Shelley, Byron and Coleridge. You've got Romanticism as a movement in art and in music too, in painting and music. But you might also think of the romances of William Shakespeare. We've just read a bunch of his late mature romances together at the book club. We've read The Tempest, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale and Pericles. When you hear the word romance, you might think of the medieval stories of King Arthur and the Round Table, or you might think of the riveting historical adventure narratives of Sir Walter Scott, an author that Emma Bovary dives into and immerses herself in, and that's closer to what we mean when we talk about romance up against realism. Though romanticism as a movement is connected too, because that developed out of and was inspired by romance, whilst also offering its own distinct philosophical and artistic concerns. Romanticism as a movement, as a literary movement, emerged as a reaction to the Age of Enlightenment and the Industrial Era. It exploded, just like the Gothic novel, out of the French Revolution and in response to ideas of reason and order dominating the intellectual conversation. Romanticism placed a greater value upon individual emotion, intense emotions like love, terror and melancholy. It valued imagination, idealization of nature and a nostalgic past, and it also elevated the supernatural and the mysterious. Up until the mid-19th century, Romanticism and romance were both king in France, and then comes the 1848 revolution, known as the February Revolution, which was an uprising that led to the fall of the monarchy of King Louis Philippe and the establishment of the Second Republic. The working class in France at this time had reached boiling point as France was suffering from severe economic crisis, massive inflation, unemployment, food shortages, and the king's government was seen as corrupt and oppressive. After the uprising and the king fleeing, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew to the Napoleon, he was elected president. And after this revolution, we see an increase in writers wanting to render and readers wanting to read about the realistic, even if the realistic is unpleasant to deal with or not as beautiful as what they were once depicting. So each artistic epoch comes in response to social turmoil. Isn't that fantastic? Social turmoil and also personal turmoil are fertile soil for the greatest works of art ever produced. That's a great mindset shift. That's a great paradigm through which to see your own personal strife and trauma. You can make something beautiful with something horrific, and you can actually see the shift from romance to realism in the writer Flaubert himself. Writers have evolution arcs. They have ages and stages and defining eras, just like history. Indeed, Ralph Waldo Emerson would see all of history contained within the individuals. Very interesting. A decade prior to writing Madame Bovary in 1849, this is the year after the Revolution, Flaubert was working on a long prose poem about Saint Anthony, which was inspired by his travels across Egypt and the Middle East, and stylistically, this work was a far cry from Madame Bovary and sentimental education. Realism really reaches its peak in sentimental education. Now, Flaubert's friends told him to ditch this work. He should even toss it into the fire, and he should instead focus on writing about the everyday. And he thought that they were onto something there. And so a few months later, at the beginning of 1850, he started to work on what would become Madame Bovary, and what would become, in my opinion, and the opinion of many readers, the key, canonical, and endlessly influential realist novel, a novel that would set the standard for all realist novels to come. Now, when it comes to realism, we have some tremendous representatives of the form in French literature. We have Balzac in the early half of the century, whose Human Comedy, or La Comédie Humaine, a collection of almost 100 interwoven novels that I implore you to investigate. His Human Comedy provides a great example of realism, and this was an incredibly ambitious artistic scheme. This is one of the sublime peaks of 19th century realism. In Balzac's work, we see that the writer, or the artist, becomes akin to the scientist, and there's this underlying assumption that life can and should be empirically studied. And then we can look to an aesthetic disciple of Balzac, and also Flaubert, for a representative from the later half of the century, who took his realism even further and developed it into naturalism, and his disciple really embraced his scientific method, and that is Émile Zola, whose 20-novel Rougon-Macquart cycle is an absolute feast, and I will be seeding some ideas at the Hardcore Literature Book Club for you along the way as we read Flaubert, for different books that you can pick up from different writers, different representatives of realism, and I'm going to try to convince you, by the time we finish this novel, to have picked up at least one Balzac or one Zola. Treat yourself and use Flaubert as an avenue even deeper into French literature. Now, you've also got an early example of realism in the work of Stendhal, who paved the way for Zola and Flaubert and also inspired Leo Tolstoy over in Russia, and he's another sublime peak of 19th century realism. Now, the art of realism would culminate in Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen at the end of the century, who really showed just how powerful the mode is when it comes to delivering perceptive social commentary. If you're interested in Ibsen, we have a lecture, we have a podcast on his Hedda Gabler, and there is much of Madame Bovary in Hedda. Now, here's the thing, however, the stark, glaring social commentary that comes through in realism can make many uncomfortable, and the critics definitely voiced their discomfort for Ibsen as they voiced it for Flaubert. The endlessly wise Oscar Wilde would say in his preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray that the 19th century dislike of realism was the rage of Caliban seeing his face in the glass. And if you've read The Tempest at the book club with us recently, then you will have met Caliban, so you'll know exactly what that means. But he also said that the 19th century dislike of romanticism was the rage of Caliban not seeing his face in the glass. I love that. You simply cannot win with some people, and that's especially true when it comes to artistic endeavours. But let's get back to romance itself as a genre or a mode. Romance which predates romanticism. Romances were quest narratives. We're talking heroes' journeys, adventure tales, and they typically featured a knight or some heroic individual who would go out on a mission in service of his lady, his lord, and the lord. And this mission would be in service of finding something, like the Holy Grail, or the answer to a riddle. And yet the external quest that the hero goes on, with all of its obstacles, dragons, warriors, giants, mishaps in nature, the external quest is important insofar as it gives rise to something internal, the development that takes place within you, what the journey does to you. It's not just about what you achieve outwardly, but where you end up is where you began, but you have changed. It's all about the insights that you have obtained in overcoming hardship and travelling down that road of trials. Romance was receiving scorn, even in its heyday, because it was massively overplayed and romance stories were becoming incredibly worn out and cliché. And we see that most powerfully with the novel Don Quixote by Cervantes, which was written in two parts between 1605 and 1615. The three horsemen of the Renaissance when it comes to literature are Shakespeare, Montaigne and Cervantes. And it's funny that that masterpiece, Don Quixote, which is in my top 10 personal favourite novels. At the moment, I'm putting together a new podcast that runs through and ranks all of my favourite works. And I can tell you now that Don Quixote absolutely makes the cut for the top 10. It's really interesting that Don Quixote became the foundation for what would ultimately be the modern novel, because that work is a parody. It's a satire, it's a comic work, but it has a river of wisdom running through it. And if you want to read just one book or dip into just one book prior to reading Madame Bovary in order to understand Flaubert's novel and his central protagonist on a very deep level, then I would implore you to make it this one. Or indeed you could check out our lecture series for Don Quixote instead at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Flaubert adored Don Quixote. He had this book read to him as a child and he loved it so much that he learnt much of it off by heart. Simply put, Don Quixote is a man who has stuffed his head with so many romances, tales of chivalry and knighthood and adventures that he has convinced himself that his life is such a tale and he is a knight errant. And we see how he undertakes adventures atop his valiant steed, actually a broken down nag called Roxanante, broken down very much like its owner. He takes these adventures along with his incredulous squire, Sancho Panza, and the adventures are very funny because they're not really adventures, he's getting himself into mishaps, but what we read for with that novel is the conversations between Sancho and the knight errant. I've said before that Shakespeare's characters, who are incredibly solipsistic, narcissistic and self-obsessed, they change because they talk through their issues, they talk their issues through aloud and they overhear themselves talking. Sancho and Don Quixote, however, change because of each other. They listen to each other and change because of it. It's beautiful to see. These conversations between them are electrifying because they feel real. They are psychologically complex protagonists. Shakespeare teaches us how to talk to ourselves. Cervantes teaches us how to talk to other people and appreciate others. And in addition to breaking down the literary tradition into romance and realism, we can also see novels as largely Shakespearean or largely Cervantine. Samuel Richardson's sprawling epistolary novel Clarissa, which I'm rereading at the moment, is Shakespearean because it is tragic and it is psychologically complex and it gives us deep interiority. Richardson learned that from The Bard. Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, on the other hand, is Cervantine because it is picaresque with its wandering hero and his exploits are tuned to the comic key. Now, whether Don Quixote, the knight errant, is actually mad or if in a mad world he chooses his madness and decides to make his reality what he wants it to be, a grand romance, whether this is the case is one of the most fascinating questions when it comes to reading that book. This is a man who sees windmills on the horizon and takes them to be monsters and so charges full pelt at them. He tilts at them and he gets himself and his squire battered and bruised over and over again. Cervantes, 250 years before Flaubert, is making much the same comment that we get come through in Madame Bovary. What happens when we are inundated with the unreal, the idealised, and the romantic? And that gives us a good point now to meet Emma Bovary. The genius thing about Flaubert's realism is the fact that the style in which the novel is written is symbiotically connected to its substance. Style and substance are married together. They inform one another and increase the work's profundity. We have a realist novel about a woman who buries herself in decidedly unrealistic, so romantic novels, and thus cannot abide reality. She's addicted to reading romances and wonderful novels. Not only that, but Flaubert makes his depiction of mundane reality so perceptive that the reading experience with this book is anything but mundane. You'd think it would be a boring book if somebody said, yeah, he's trying to depict everyday reality and the most boring, humdrum things. You'd think, what's the use in reading that? But you read this work and it's electrifying because it's so perceptive. What we have with this book is pure escapism. This is a profoundly immersive story. We don't need knights or damsels in distress. We don't need dragons or monsters to be hooked, to be relentlessly entertained. Now, we already know that because we have had so many stories just like this one since Flaubert's novel, and we are hooked by them. That's why we watch soap operas or reality TV. Now, of course, Flaubert would intuit what Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung would establish after him. He also hits on a lot of Freudian ideas before Freud. He would intuit what Campbell and Jung knew, that mythological archetypes are part of a universal language. We all have our own dragons to slay on the hero's journey that is our life. We need not escape from reality. When we realise that our life, our reality, can be a grand adventure. And if you're interested in these particular ideas, then you might want to check out our lecture on Ovid's Metamorphoses called The Age of Heroes that went up recently at the book club, and we talk about heroes like Jason, Achilles and Aeneas. I strongly believe that realism became the new romance, and it offered readers the same escape and refreshing immersion that we have always craved. But now, in bringing stories to domestic settings and revolving around everyday people, these novels suddenly became relatable. Tolstoy, whose Anna Karenina has the DNA of Flaubert's Emma Bovary woven into her, put it best when he said, "Man survives earthquakes, epidemics, the horrors of disease and agonies of the soul, but all the time his most tormenting tragedy has been, is, and will always be the tragedy of the bedroom." What we have fundamentally with Madame Bovary is a novel about the experience of reading novels. This is a novel that captures what it is like to be a reader. And it's interesting that Emma Bovary, who is the archetypical reader, rarely gets much sympathy from readers. Not like Anna Karenina, who solicits a variety of responses, good and bad, but ultimately readers tend to understand her. No matter what they think, they sympathise with her and understand her. But with Emma Bovary, it's not always the case. Flaubert would famously say, "Emma Bovary, c'est moi." Yeah, it's me, I'm Emma. And of course, the author always puts something of themselves into their central protagonists. But if you read Flaubert's letters, which is a really excellent thing to do, you could even read these letters in lieu of reading a biography, because if you get Francis Steegmuller's translation and compilation of his letters, it reads like a thrilling autobiography. The letters shed light on how Madame Bovary came to be, because he talks about the composition process in much the same way that we get that in John Steinbeck's Diary of East of Eden. It's very similar. But if you read his letters, you can likely see where some of the influence for Emma came from. His affair with his married mistress, Louise Collet, who was a writer in her own right, inspires Emma Bovary, along with a contemporary sensational news story and real-life scandal that had recently gripped France. Though I'm not going to say any more about that real-life event because it will spoil Madame Bovary, and we're staying away from spoilers here. Many readers will say that they find Emma Bovary to be annoying and insufferable, emotionally immature and underdeveloped, selfish, vain, naive and reckless. And that's pretty understandable and a fair response. My challenge to you, however, as you read through the book, is to try to sympathise with her. Try to sympathise with all the different characters. And that really is a strong challenge, given the detachment and irony with which Flaubert presents them. And Flaubert's characters can be both incredibly realistic and complex, but they can also present as grotesque distortions and types. But regardless, ask yourself the question that Roxana Robinson asked her students when she taught the book. Does Flaubert want us to feel contempt or compassion for his characters? Readers may not like Emma, and she won't be the only Emma that we meet together at the book club this year that readers can be divided on. Later this year we're going to read Jane Austen's Emma, and she famously said of her central protagonist that she's writing a heroine that no one but herself would like. Now, I actually really like Emma, but we'll talk about that later this year. And to have read Jane Austen and Gustave Flaubert in the same year will be a revelation. It'll be a really complimentary thing to do. Readers may not like Emma Bovary, but how can any lover of literature not relate to how she escapes into fictive worlds? Very briefly, and again without spoilers, because if you haven't read this book before, if you're coming to it for the first time, I really do implore you to protect yourself in regards to the narrative trajectory. So I'm going to be asking readers of the book club who are rereading Madame Bovary, it's a good one to reread, to keep things under wraps as to where the story goes. I'd like to see what first readers think and where they think it's going to go. We see in the story that Emma is sent off to a convent as a teenager, and she's taught by nuns. And whilst she enjoys religious life at first, grief over her mother's death directs her further into books instead, and thus great stories, or indeed tawdry romances and adventure stories, offer her a much needed escape. I remember when I was a teenager at school, stories offered me a grand escape too. She dreams of their fantastical scenarios, and she lives vicariously through them. Now, she ultimately gets pulled out of the convent, and it's worth remembering at that time, novels were not seen in a great light. Today, we see somebody who reads novels as studious, yeah? They're a scholar. It's a learned, educational pursuit today, but this was not always the case. We really do have writers like Flaubert and Austen to thank for elevating the form, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. We're told that Emma loved stories about love affairs, lovers, mistresses, harassed ladies, swooning in remote pavilions. Couriers were killed at every relay. Horses ridden to death on every page. There were gloomy forests, broken hearts, vows, sobs, tears and kisses, skiffs in the moonlight, nightingales in thickets. The noblemen were all brave as lions, gentle as lambs, incredibly virtuous, always beautifully dressed, and wept copiously on every occasion. For 6 months, when she was 15, Emma begrimed her hands with this dust from old lending libraries. Later, reading Walter Scott, she became infatuated with everything historical and dreamed about oaken chests and guard rooms and troubadours. She would have liked to live in some old manor, like those long-waisted chatelaines who spent their days leaning out of fretted Gothic casements, below on parapet and chin in hand, watching a white-plumed knight come galloping out of the distance on a black horse. Isn't that fantastic? We've just been given a romance in miniature by Flaubert thanks to the interiority of Emma Bovary. We've all been there. We've all had these dreams. Now, Emma ends up meeting the widowed doctor Charles Bovary. And indeed, Flaubert's father was a doctor. He was a surgeon, so he knew the medical profession well. She meets Charles in her provincial town when he comes to give medical care to her father, and she thinks that this man is the key to her happiness, and that love awaits, and it will be as glorious and exciting as it is depicted in her favourite novels. And they end up getting married. And she comes to a rude awakening because she was ultimately projecting her fantasies onto a rather banal and bleak reality. She wants her romances, her romantic idealization, to be reality, and she cannot accept reality. But that's what happens. And so her marriage does not meet the idealized relationships that she has been reading about. She starts comparing her husband and her life to the books she's been reading, which is a really dangerous thing to do. As we say, comparison is the thief of joy, and comparing our lives to fiction is a fool's errand. And human nature hasn't changed. We still continue to do this, maybe not with books per se, maybe not as thoroughly with fiction, but we do it when it comes to how the lives of other people are presented on social media or on the television. We do much the same thing, and we come up against much the same problem, not being able to deal with harsh or mundane reality. Now, she's really unhappy. He, Charles, on the other hand, is very happy, and he's blissfully unaware. He's very happy with the relationship, and he makes no effort to find out or care if she is. And indeed, Emma actually says to herself, if only he had made the slightest effort, she would be relieved of her anxiety. She just needs him to care a little bit. Are we reminded, if we've read Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, we have lectures for Anna Karenina and also War and Peace at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, are we reminded of Anna's relationship with Alexei? I think so. So it could have been sorted if only he had cared to sort it. Their relationship, however, was one of great detachment. And we see he takes great pride in her because she's a great wife, at least for a little bit. She elevates his status because of how she keeps their home and how she entertains visitors. But he continues to think not at all about her happiness. So again, this is a common thing in human nature and human relationships. We are told, in her eagerness for a change, and this is one of her problems, she thinks that just changing the circumstances of her life will change her. Now, that does happen. As we said about the hero's journey, that's a great change and it leads to inward change. But she thinks just merely changing the setting or merely changing some superficial things will remedy what's going on inside of her. In her eagerness for a change, or perhaps overstimulated by this man's presence, she easily persuaded herself that love, that marvellous thing, which had hitherto been like a great rosy-plumaged bird soaring in the splendours of poetic skies, was at last within her grasp. And now she could not bring herself to believe that the uneventful life she was leading was the happiness of which she had dreamed. Oh, that's painful. Poetic, but painful. We see that she's disappointed by their so-called honeymoon days. Weren't they supposed to be the most beautiful days of her life? And wasn't the sweetness of their relationship supposed to be enjoyed in distant, exotic, and romantic lands? But that's not how things go. Now, over the course of our reading at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we'll approach our reading in a therapeutic way so that we can improve our own relationships or potential relationships by seeing the mishaps and failings of others, characters in a book. We can give ourselves the best advice. So we're going to learn some things that will improve our day-to-day relationships, our romantic relationships together. And here's a mindset shift. A lot of pain is caused by what we think things are supposed to look like. And once again, we can get a lot of those expectations and entitlements from fiction or whatever today's equivalent is. And if we constantly think about what we do not have rather than appreciating what we do have, because we can make a choice to focus on what we have or what we don't, if we constantly compare ourselves to other people that don't even exist, then we are on a painful collision course when reality tells us how things really are and can be. And this is why marriage vows emphasize the good and the bad. I take you in sickness and health. Everybody can stay together when times are good. It's the bad times. That's why we make those vows, because it's the idea of having someone who will stay with you no matter what when times get tough, because life is not a romance, it's reality. Indeed, even in romance, especially in romance, there is much hardship and challenge to overcome. Now, we see that the issue with Emma's relationship is not that it's overtly bad, he's not a horrific person, but it's just bland and devoid of passion. And we've spoken before in lectures on some of Molière's plays and Shakespeare's plays, we've spoken about how misanthropy, hating mankind, is typically born out of having once had great idealism, great hopes for the world. You don't hate mankind if you do not think them better or capable of being better. And I think the same is true when it comes to a situation like Emma is experiencing. She's had high, unrealistic hopes, and now they are dashed because real life cannot live up to her dreams. And there are so many reasons as to why Emma's illusions are shattered after not much time spent with her husband. One problem is that she thinks he doesn't know anything. He cannot tell her about a word that she read in a book. So discussions about the literature she's enjoying, that's not going to happen. He doesn't take her on whirlwind adventures. He doesn't have passionate conversations with her about all the many things that she's curious about. And she says to herself, aren't men supposed to know things? Aren't they supposed to inaugurate us into the mysteries of life? And we're told, before her marriage, she had thought that she had love within her grasp. But since the happiness which she had expected this love to bring her hadn't come, she supposed she must have been mistaken. And Emma tried to imagine just what was meant in her life by the words bliss, passion, and rapture, words that had seemed so beautiful to her in books. Let's talk about women in 19th century France, because we read about these individuals to know something a bit more widely applicable, a bit more universal. We get these societal comments come through in the individual. And though many readers see his views on women as complex and contradictory, we see that Flaubert has great sympathy towards women and their position at this time. Here's another problem that Emma is dealing with. Women at this time have a lack of autonomy, agency and personal freedom when compared to their male counterparts. There's a moment shortly after their marriage in which, when she's clearly descending into quite severe depression, Emma grows angry, lazy, she stops dressing properly, and she starts scandalising people with the immoral things that she says. She wants to talk of masked balls and the exciting things that might happen at them. She stops looking after herself so much, and we see that she stops doing the things that had once given her and others joy, like playing the piano. Women's education at this time was restricted, and women were expected to have accomplishments. So they can paint, they can play the piano, maybe speak a few languages, but they wouldn't be learning anything that could get them into the job market, because that really wasn't a thing at all at this time, for the middle class at least. So she abandons playing the piano. Why? Because what's the point of playing music with no one to hear? She will never be a concert pianist, she thinks. So she's got these high hopes and dreams, but the world, reality, is blocking her off from them. And indeed, at this time, if a woman were to be something, it would usually be tied to her husband. Now, we have exceptions that end up proving the rule, with great women writers like the Bronte sisters, like George Eliot, like Jane Austen, for example, but more or less a woman's status would be tied to her husband, and women's lives were largely controlled by the men in their lives, their father, then their husband. You were always defined up against your relation to a man. Women, of course, couldn't vote at this time. Now, male suffrage had been introduced a decade prior to the publication of Madame Bovary, but women were excluded from that. Women also needed their husband's permission to work and to travel, and whilst women could own property prior to marriage, upon marriage it became their husband's property. Divorce also was banned in the early part of the century and wouldn't be reintroduced until the later part of the 19th century. So if you found yourself caught in an abusive relationship, you would effectively be stuck around this time. And if you did separate, custody rights went to the father and not the mother. And adultery laws were also massively skewed against women. A woman could actually face imprisonment if she was caught cheating on her husband, whilst men did not have those consequences. And of course, there were also severe social consequences around sex for women. that men did not have. Now, if a man slept around or he slept out of wedlock, he was considered a dangerous man, he was considered a rake or a libertine, but it was worse for women. A woman would be considered fallen if she had sex out of wedlock, and this is something that we've discussed at the book club when we have met writers like Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy. Because it was so limited as to what a woman could do or even be, and we see that women writers from George Sand to George Eliot would take male pen names partly for this fact. Because of this, a woman's sense of importance would derive from her husband. And so, if your husband was an ambitious man, rising in the world, if he was well loved and making a success of things in his career, then you could derive your satisfaction from that. And this is one of the many things that Emma dislikes about Charles Bovary. She's unable to live life on her own terms, so she becomes dissatisfied when others aren't living their life on her terms again, because she has to live through them, and so if they're not doing things that she wants them to do, it's very, very frustrating. She's got no autonomy. And the ambition that she wants for her husband, she would likely seek for herself if she could. Early on, we're told that she wished the name Bovary would become famous, but that's not going to happen because her husband had no ambition. Why does he just fall asleep after dinner? That's what she thinks. Now, he's out all day attending to his medical practice, visiting patients, going back and forth on horseback, so he's not giving her much thought. She's got the other problem. She's not getting much variety at all. He's getting too much of it. He comes home, has his dinner, tries to read from the medical journals for a bit, but he just falls asleep. He falls asleep early, and every day it's rinse, repeat, and she thinks if she were him, she'd stay up all night reading medical journals. She would lose herself in her work and she would make herself rise in the world. And she would also leave this humdrum provincial town, which is really contributing to her life becoming like Groundhog Day. Wouldn't it be better if we were in the great city of Paris? Day after day, mundanity reigns, and we're told everything immediately surrounding her. Boring countryside. Inane, petty bourgeois, the mediocrity of daily life seemed to her the exception rather than the rule. And this is another huge issue, as I said, that we are dealing with today. It isn't just the repetition and the same old routine. Now, some people love a good routine and a quiet life. Some people are very happy with that. Some people are not. Some people are not happy with routine at all. The issue that we are always dealing with is not just the routine, but the notion that you're the only one living like this, and everyone else is constantly having a whale of a time, and aren't you silly because your life is not a constant celebration, a constant colourful pageant. That's the real problem. It's not that you're bored, it's that you think everyone else isn't bored, and you're the odd one out. And for Emma, her novels have provided a barrier to her experiencing and embracing love. She cannot distinguish love and passion from the romantic environments in which they are described in books. Sighs and embraces go hand in hand with castles and knights. And as her husband falls short from her high romantic ideals, we see her seek her passion elsewhere. So Flaubert is ultimately casting a damning critique of romance and escapism, even whilst delivering it, and a damning critique of vicarious living, even whilst he is living vicariously, because that's what he did when he was writing. He lived through his books. He lived through this story. He became the characters. He lived there. And that's what we want from our reading too, but we don't want to get lost and never re-emerge. And why did Flaubert live through his fiction? Well, he was going through a lot of pain, physical and emotional, and great literature arises from pain and tragedy. Creating art was Flaubert's escape in much the same way that appreciating it is our escape. Flaubert had been studying to become a lawyer in Paris, but he abandoned his plan when a serious epileptic seizure left him feeling very weak, and he rethought the entire course of his life. Shortly after this, he withdrew and became a hermit. He didn't really want to become a lawyer, but his dad was a doctor, a surgeon, and so that would be the respectable course of action, become a lawyer. He wanted to be a writer, though. Now, things got even worse for Flaubert when his father and his sister, who he was very close to, died, and he started to suffer from health problems that would plague him throughout his life, particularly from the syphilis that he picked up during his journeys across the Middle East. And by that point, he was resolute. He was going to dedicate himself to writing and lose himself in his craft, using it as a palliative for his despair and feelings of solitude. Now, the story of Emma Bovary might sound familiar. Unhappily married woman commits adultery. It's a kitchen sink soap opera narrative and a tale that we're all familiar with. Though the subject matter, the focus on domesticity and the banal, the everyday, this would have been revolutionary for Flaubert's readers, as would the style. As we've said, Flaubert was one of the writers really ushering realism in. But what does realism actually look like? And what are the tools in Flaubert's toolkit that writers today still rely on? The techniques that Flaubert honed are so thoroughly taken for granted today that it can actually be rather difficult to apprehend them and appreciate them until they're really pointed out. What we want to focus on here is the lack of authorial intrusion, free indirect discourse, and the idea of the perfect word. Let's talk about the idea of le mot juste, the perfect word. Madame Bovary would take Flaubert 5 years to write, and we're talking 5 years of 12-hour workdays. He'd sometimes write for 16 hours, and he would compose his work whilst reading aloud. He was trying to weigh and balance his sentences because he was searching for the perfect word. And this is where the realist writer becomes a scientist empirically studying the world around them. There is an extraordinary amount of precision in this work, and Flaubert's prose stylistics and painstaking attention to detail would impact his productivity in an era in which writers were prolific because they were paid by the word and they needed to pump out their works in order to survive. And in a world of mass-produced fiction, this book is a highly wrought, beautiful luxury item. Flaubert would take years where others would take months. And I think of James Joyce writing in the century after him, and without Flaubert there is no Joyce. James Joyce would write 7 words on a good day, but he would find himself despairing when they were in the wrong order. One of the qualities of great art is inevitability, the sense that the line of poetry or prose that you have before you, the phrases that compose a particular work, the sense that it could not have been any other way, and that there's no better word than the word you have right there, the one that you are reading. And this is why translations, and we'll talk about that in a moment, this is why translations often fail. For a translator to capture the perfect word in a language, they have to be an artist in both languages. That's a tall order. The effect of reading Flaubert's prose is that it is crisp, it is clear, and it feels inevitable. It feels as though everything is exactly as it is detailed. Now, you will not find the abstract or the cliché or the inexact in Madame Bovary. In a letter to George Sand, he would say that he was trying to write harmonious sentences, and elsewhere he would say he was forging a style as rhythmic as verse, precise as the language of the sciences, and a style that would pierce your idea like a dagger. So, on the one hand, we have ostensibly empirical presentation of the factual world, the world of sense impressions around us, and on the other hand, Flaubert is trying to write visually striking, crisp, perfect sentences so that you can see everything like a painting, and simultaneously he's writing with great musicality, great harmony and melody, and everything is rendered with great subtlety and delicacy. Like with Jane Austen, Flaubert's genius is in his subtlety and also in his subtext. There's enormous subtext in this book that I implore you to watch out for. He would say that there is more being said in the blank parts of his work than in the lines themselves, more between the lines. And this is common to all great writers. One reason for the subtext is because Flaubert would write mountains and mountains of material and then cull it away, strip it down, pass it down. And so for every sentence in this book, there are at least 10 more that could have been written and probably were written but are not here. And that's why it feels so realistic. That's why it feels authentic. There is an entire world hidden behind ostensibly simple sentences. And one of Flaubert's most powerful tools was making the narrator himself invisible. He wanted his readers to see everything. And in that sense, we might say that Joseph Conrad is a Flaubertian writer too, because he had much the same aim. He wanted his readers to see everything without any tinge of caricature or personal opinion, the opinion of the author intruding into the narrative. Famously, he said, "An author in his book must be like God in the universe, present everywhere and visible nowhere." He would give a writing exercise to Émile Zola. He would tell him to look hard and look long at something until every aspect of it is apparent. He would tell him to go to a restaurant, observe the patrons and describe them so crisply and clearly that if he were to go to that restaurant, he would find the people described and not confuse them for anybody else. Let's take a passage from the book as an example for the crisp, clear, perfect visuality of Flaubert. The rain had stopped. Day was breaking, and on the leafless branches of the apple trees, birds were perched motionless, ruffling up their little feathers in the cold morning wind. Isn't that glorious? Notice the objectivity of it. Where is the author? Where's the narrator? Now, of course, there is an author because there has been a selection process to get to this. We see those birds ruffling their feathers on the leafless branches of an apple tree specifically in the cold. We see that rather than another detail on the landscape, and yet we take the landscape for reality. We take it that it is actually in existence. But we're not thinking of the author overtly, are we? And we really do take this for granted today. Readers will struggle to appreciate trailblazers like Flaubert, like Jane Austen, Shakespeare and Anton Chekhov because they are so monumentally influential. But prior to Flaubert, the same passage there, described by a writer like, say, Henry Fielding, who wrote Tom Jones. And if you want to study the novel, study Fielding, study Flaubert, study Austen. You might want to study Trollope too, Anthony Trollope. If Fielding were to write that same passage, it would go on for several pages and would include a bunch of digressions about the narrator themselves and the reader. Are you enjoying the book, dear reader? And what's going to happen in this chapter? And what happened in the previous one? And isn't it all amazing? Are you enjoying it? That's what it would feel like. The narrator was once incredibly self-conscious and overt, like a character themselves. And Flaubert and Austen hid the narrator. Now, I said that you won't find the cliché, the abstract and the inexact in this book, but if a reader flips through Madame Bovary, they might say, hey, wait a minute, no clichés? No authorial intrusion? I can find evidence of that everywhere. Look, there's a cliché here, another one here. Isn't this authorial intrusion? Isn't this the narrator speaking? You could point to multiple examples per page of this kind of thing, but I challenge you to look closely at the clichés that you find and try to find an instance in which they belong to Flaubert. Yeah? Now, of course, the whole work belongs to Flaubert, but Flaubert as narrator. Now, Flaubert loved a good simile. A simile is a metaphor. It's figurative language in which something is described as being like something else. Flaubert loved metaphorical language, and he would say that sentences are adventures unto themselves. It's a great mindset to have going into this book. Sentences are adventures, and searching for metaphors is like gathering flowers. I love that. His mother would ultimately accuse Flaubert of being obsessed with sentences. Your obsession with sentences has dried up your heart, she said. Let's take just one of many countless examples of metaphor in this novel and see who it belongs to. See if we can find Flaubert peeking out. Feeling that she cannot talk to her husband and that she could only actually share her secrets with her dog before her husband. Dogs are great companions. You can share many a secret with your dog and they won't tell anyone. They're wonderful. We're told this: like a sailor in distress, she kept casting desperate glances over the solitary waste of her life, seeking some white sail in the distant mists of the horizon. She had no idea by what wind it would reach her, toward what shore it would bear her, or what kind of craft it would be. Whether it would be a tiny boat or a towering vessel, the metaphor continues to be extended. And notice the musicality of it all. Isn't it beautiful? It's so harmonious, the sway and lilt. There's a little bit of internal rhyme going on. Flaubert's prose is just sumptuous. It's a feast. Now, that metaphor of being like a sailor in distress, that is not Flaubert's. Again, ultimately the entire book comes from him, but it's not the narrator figure providing it. That simile belongs to Emma Bovary herself. And so we are taken into the mind of the protagonist via what is known as free indirect discourse. I love this technique, it's beautiful, and we've spoken about this extensively during our Pride and Prejudice and our Persuasion lecture series because, of course, Jane Austen was a pioneer when it came to free and direct discourse. We'll be reading Emma later this year. My aim at the Hardcore Literature Book Club is to get you through all of Jane Austen and all of Dickens and all of Shakespeare. So we're going to be reading Emma and I can't wait. But Flaubert took free and direct style to its extreme and really refined it. Free and direct style or discourse is where the thoughts of the characters tinge the narrative. They intrude into the narrative. Not the narrator's thoughts, the character's thoughts. That's the difference. They aren't directly related through speech or direct thought, but they intrude. Yeah, and so in this way we continue to have third-person omniscient narration, whilst also gaining privileged access to the interiority of the characters. And thus, the realist writer really is like God in the universe, present everywhere, but visible nowhere. This metaphor of being like a sailor is so Emma. It belongs to her and comes from her and is clearly influenced by the adventure books that she has been reading. We see the world through our paradigms and preoccupations. Shakespeare saw all the world as a stage and all the men and women as merely actors playing their parts. Why? Because he was a playmaker. We see the world through what we give ourselves to. Whilst Emma, we see, is seeing her mundane life in terms of fiction and romance. Now, ultimately, what Flaubert is doing in seeking after the perfect word is he's trying to take prose to the condition of poetry. And this is really worth appreciating too. Walter Pater, who thought all art constantly aspired to the condition of music, he would call Flaubert the martyr of style. And martyr is brilliant terminology because Flaubert did not believe in God, and yet he was obsessively fascinated with religion and the devotion of disciples of a religion or a body of mystical thought. He was fascinated with the devotion that disciples dedicate themselves to. You can tell from the etymology that disciple is connected to the word discipline. Like Friedrich Nietzsche, and we spoke about this recently in our lecture and podcast on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, like Nietzsche, Flaubert knew that the modern mind would knock God from the centre of its meaning and thus replace it with something else. What comes in to fill the power vacuum left by God? Well, could be science, could be politics, could be celebrity. In Flaubert's day, it was science. And for Flaubert, his craft, which was his science, his art, his fiction, his aestheticism became his god. Art for art's sake. That became his meaning around which he ordered his life, and he became an aesthetic mystic of sorts. To his mistress, Louise Collet, around the time of starting to write Madame Bovary, Flaubert would say, and this is brilliant, "Prose was born yesterday. That is what we must tell ourselves. Verse is the quintessential form of ancient literatures. All the combinations of poetry have been tried out, but as for prose, far from it." And this is so true. Epics used to be written in grand, sublime, sweeping poetry. We're reading Homer later this year at the book club. We've read Dante's Inferno, 1 part of 3 of the Divina Commedia. We've read Paradise Lost together. We've just read Ovid's Metamorphoses. In the future, we've got to read Virgil's Aeneid. All of these epics were written in verse. But the epics of the modern world, which we can take to be spanning the last couple of 100 years, come in the form of prose that sought to push prose to its breaking level and take it to the condition of poetry. Whether we're talking about the defamiliarization of Tolstoy's epic, War and Peace, or the relentless experimentalism of James Joyce's Ulysses. We've got a Russian epic there, we've got an Irish epic there. Epics started to be written in prose. But also, smaller books like Madame Bovary were playgrounds. They were experimental realms where prose could be taken up towards the heavens. Now, all of this sounds incredibly positive, doesn't it? Flaubert revolutionised art and the novel form with realism, seeking after truth, sympathising with the plight of women, and creating harmonious sentences. What's not to like? Well, evidently there was a lot not to like, as public prosecutors for the government under Napoleon III attacked the work for its obscenity, citing that it promoted adultery and offended the morality of the public and religious orders. We read it today and we perhaps struggle to find ourselves scandalised by it at all, and that's a real testament to just how different times are now. Some things remain the same, some things have changed. The prosecution against Flaubert was led by a man called Ernest Pinard, who would also lead the prosecution against Charles Baudelaire the same year for much the same reasons. Upon publication of Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil, police kicked in the door of Baudelaire's publisher, seized his books, and 6 of his poems specifically were indicted by the criminal court for affront to public decency. He was put on trial because of his poetry's crude realism when depicting matters of sex. At the book club, I'm going to be putting some recommended resources as usual along the way during our read-through. Recommendations for films, documentaries, adaptations, complementary side avenues. I'm going to point you to some of my favourite TV and film adaptations of Madame Bovary. So we'll have some film appreciation and we'll talk about these adaptations in our discussions, whether they're faithful, whether they're good or not. And I'm also going to recommend specifically that you read some of Flaubert's letters. He has an exchange with Charles Baudelaire around this time. He reached out to him and the two men found a sympathetic ear in one another, and they would ultimately promote and endorse one another's works. As part of the charges against Flaubert, the prosecutors would actually cite the lack of authorial intrusion, the very aesthetic technique that Flaubert was pioneering and would become monumentally influential. They cited that as proof of his encouraging or glorifying adultery. Now, if you read the book, it really doesn't feel like he's doing that at all. The author failed to provide moral judgment, they said, moral judgment on his character's actions, and thus he was clearly promoting them. Here's the thing, just because an author presents something doesn't mean they are an advocate for it. They're simply trying to be truthful to reality. Now, Flaubert's lawyer, a man called Jules Sénard, who he thanks and actually dedicates an early edition of Madame Bovary to, and we might think in classical antiquity, great writers invoked the muse and dedicated their works to the muse and wanted the muse to work through them at the beginning of their work. But in the 19th century onwards into the modern age and around the birth of realism, we have writers giving thanks to their obscenity lawyers. Jules Sénard defended Flaubert by saying that the novel actually condemns adultery, not glorifies it, and that the book was ultimately a moral warning about the dangers of romantic delusion and passion. And he mounted an aesthetic defence, pointing to Flaubert's style, which is refined and elegant and literary, not vulgar or crude. And also the lack of condemnation is not damning, because there's a lack of praising too. He's trying to be objective. The novel seeks to produce objective reality. So they tried to mount a moral defence, when in fact I do believe that Flaubert would have ultimately agreed with Oscar Wilde after him, that there's no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. The resulting trial against Flaubert, which lasted just one day in January of 1857, proves that all publicity is good publicity, and the best way to get someone to read a book is by slapping a banned or censored or obscene sticker on its cover and telling them that they absolutely should not read it. And this would work for James Joyce's Ulysses and D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover in the 20th century, and it worked for Flaubert's Madame Bovary, making it notorious in the 19th century. Flaubert was acquitted in the following month of February of 1857, and the judge ruled that the book was provocative but not obscene, whilst he also warned that literature did ultimately have a duty and an obligation to promote morality. And Madame Bovary would become a bestseller by spring, when it was published in 2 volumes in April of the same year. Now, it had first been serialised the year prior, across 12 weeks in 6 instalments in the Revue de Paris, between October and December. So you have it published in serial form, obscenity trial, then published in book form, all happening over the course of half a year. And it really is quite funny how quickly the trial was brought for this, and one wonders whether there weren't better things for the justice system to be focusing on around this time. And at the book club, as always, we love to align our reading with the seasons, and in a way that we can pretend to be the first readers. And so together we're going to step back in time, and we're going to read Madame Bovary as though we have just followed the trial, and now the book is exploding in popularity and becoming a bestseller. We're stepping back in time, visiting the lending library, and we're getting hold of this sensational story that is causing quite a stir. Now, let's talk practicalities, namely translation, what's the best translation, and pacing. What's a good pacing for Madame Bovary, or indeed, what's the pacing that I'll be following for the lectures at the Hardcore Literature Book Club? At the book club, each of our books, our lecture series, is designed to be appreciated in its own right. So if you're new, Madame Bovary is a really great place to start. I strive to make every lecture series its own entrance into the wider tradition. Simultaneously, these books also work within the context of all the other books that we have read together. So the more you become a long-term reader with us, the more satisfying clicks and insights will emerge, the more parallels and connections you will uncover, and you will discover that literature really is a labyrinth of linkages, as Tolstoy would say. Literature is a great conversation, as Mortimer Adler would say. And each year at the book club, the year's reading programme is designed in such a way that the books are all incredibly complementary to one another, and a book that you've read earlier in the year will inform a book that you read later in the year, and these writers will enter a dialogue with each other. They're complementary, not just thematically and stylistically, but also in regards to our pacing. We began this year challenging ourselves by reading at least 2 books simultaneously. What a great way to kick off the year, to get a really respectable win in the bag early on and to feel that success. We alternated between them. That was 100 Years of Solitude and Ovid's Metamorphoses. So we had the modern, or indeed the postmodern, and the ancient, the classical. That was really rewarding. Now we're building in some active recovery. A great reading programme is just like a great athletic programme, and we've got a little bit of a deload whilst also clocking another great book. And we're going to shift from polygamous reading to monogamous reading. We want to be able to read in both ways and do these really rewarding gear shifts from one to another. Now, different readers will favour different styles of reading. I'm naturally polygamous when it comes to my reading habits, as you may be able to tell. Monogamy is the challenge. But for other readers, they like to be monogamous, and reading multiple books is the challenge. And typically, you envy the other style of reader for what they can do with the books. We want to be able to do both. And so now we're giving our prime focus to Madame Bovary. This active recovery will also serve us well when we increase the challenge. Hey, we're hardcore literature, it's a hardcore book club. When we increase the challenge at the heights of spring, because we will be reading Faulkner and Chaucer together. We'll be alternating, and don't let these names scare you. It really is amazing what you can accomplish when you have a great support group and you can take things one bit at a time. Readers who have been reading with us for a little while will tell you that they're really impressed with how they've managed to clock some of these big names with greater ease and enjoyment than they thought possible. So ultimately, I do encourage self-pacing at the book club. The club is set up so you can go at the pace that best suits you. And we're aiming for evergreen content and discussions. But if you're following in real time, for Madame Bovary, in much the same way that we immersed ourselves in Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy at the end of last year, we will be taking this one across the course of 4 weeks together at the book club. Check out the post for this video at the book club for this week's reading assignment, and you will see that if you can read around 10 pages per day, you'll be in line for when our next lecture comes out. Now, you can also enjoy the lectures even if you're taking a little bit longer to read. I'm a slow reader naturally. If you're taking a little bit longer, you can still enjoy the lectures because I will be staying away from spoilers for things later in the narrative. So that's pacing, but let's talk practicalities for those who do not have French. And I've heard from so many readers now who have said that they've learned a language because of the great books we've been reading, whether that's Spanish for Garcia Marquez and Cervantes, Russian for Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, or French for Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas. That's really great. Of course, it would be difficult to do that for each and every great book. You kind of have to pick a language at a time, at least I think you do. And so I am grateful that we live in a time in which translators are artists in their own right, and we are spoilt for choice when it comes to great translation. And picking the right translation really is one of the most important things when it comes to reading the great books. It is the difference between falling madly in love with a book and reading it over and over again across the course of your life and putting it down and abandoning it out of frustration. I am convinced that you need to pick the right translation for you. When readers have a problem with a great book and can't get through it, 9 out of 10 times it really does come down to the translation. So, which translation should we choose for Madame Bovary? Let's do a little taste test, but if you want the decision made for you, and if you want to read the translation that I will be working from for our Madame Bovary lecture series at the book club, which isn't necessary, sometimes it's nice to have multiple readers using different translations so we can contrast and compare and see the nuances of what's being written. But if you want to use the translation I like, then I highly recommend the 1957 Francis Steegmuller translation, which is available in Everyman Library hardback edition. It's also available in Modern Library edition. I find the Steegmuller to be really highly readable. It's beautiful, it's musical, it's very visual. I've been told that it captures the feel of Flaubert, especially when it comes to Flaubert's irony and his humour. Now, Steegmuller can paraphrase things from time to time, but ultimately I find the Steegmuller to be an absolute dream to read. You can see my trusty Steegmuller in Modern Library edition here. I've read this absolutely to death. Another great translation option would be the Lydia Davis. This is more of a recent one, written or translated in 2010, available in Penguin Deluxe. The Lydia Davis is magnificent. She's a great writer in her own right. Her short stories are very, very good, but her translation is beautiful, and this is another excellent option. Now, the very first translation into English was actually by the governess of Flaubert's niece, Juliette Herbert. And whilst Flaubert expressed great happiness around the competence of this translation, his correspondence between him and this translator were burnt, and the translation itself, not to mention any picture of the translator, has never been found. So you can't read that one. And then after that you had the Eleanor Marx Aveling translation. That's Karl Marx's daughter. She published an English translation in 1886. This was the first major English translation. Marx himself was really impressed with the novel, and Vladimir Nabokov used this translation for his Madame Bovary lecture series, and we can tell from his marginalia that he was not a fan of it. In fact, he was really frustrated with it. I think the choice ultimately is between the Steegmuller and the Davis. Davis has been praised for her ultra precision and accuracy when it comes to Flaubert's syntax and word choice. Plenty of translators make really big mistakes with this. Steegmuller pointed that out in his introduction. Whilst some readers find the Davis to be overly literal, which could give the prose a stiff quality, I actually think it's an astonishing achievement. It's beautiful, harmonious, faithful, refreshing, and simply a joy to read. Ultimately, it might come down to which medium you like. Do you prefer hardback or paperback? If you want a hardback, then Steegmuller is readily available. If you want a paperback, then Lydia Davis is readily available. You'll also see the Lowell Blair available in Bantam. You'll see the Geoffrey Wall available in Penguin. The Adam Thorpe is another one that you'll see mentioned. That's a really poetic one. You've got the Margaret Malden available in Oxford World's Classics. I won't name them all because there are simply quite a lot of them. So if I haven't mentioned one, that's not me saying it's not good enough. You might want to do your own taste test and review a few different options. But I've narrowed the selection down to just a few that I've got on hand from the most popular publishing houses. So let's taste test the same sample passage in each. So in this part of the book, this is quite early on, we have a conversation between Emma and a man that she has a growing infatuation with, a man called Leon, who says in the Steegmuller, "What's more delightful than an evening beside the fire with a nice bright lamp and a book, listening to the wind beating against the windows?" "How true," she said, her great dark eyes fixed widely on him. "I'm absolutely removed from the world at such times," he said. "The hours go by without my knowing it. Sitting there, I'm wandering in countries I can see every detail of. I'm playing a role in the story I'm reading. I actually feel I'm the characters. I live and breathe with them." "I know," she said. "I feel the same." "Have you ever had the experience," Leon went on, "of running across in a book some vague idea you've had, some image that you realise has been lurking all the time in the back of your mind and now seems to express absolutely your most subtle feelings?" "Indeed I have," she answered. "That's why I'm especially fond of poetry," he said. "I find it much more affecting than prose. It's much more apt to make me cry. Still, it's tiresome in the long run." Emma replied, "Nowadays I'm crazy about a different kind of thing. Stories full of suspense. Stories that frighten you. I hate to read about low-class heroes and their down-to-earth concerns. The sort of thing the real world's full of." So that's the Steegmuller. Let's check out the same passage quickly from the Lydia Davis. Leon says, "What could be better, really, than to sit by the fire in the evening with a book, while the wind beats against the window panes and the lamp burns?" "Oh yes," she said, her great, dark, wide-open eyes fixed on him. "You forget everything," he went on, "and hours go by. Without moving, you walk through lands you imagine you can see, and your thoughts, weaving in and out of the story, delight in the details or follow the outlines of the adventures. You merge with the character. You think you're the one whose heart is beating so hard within the clothes he's wearing." "It's so true, it's so true." "Have you ever had the experience," Leon went on, "while reading a book, of coming upon some vague idea that you've had yourself, some obscure image that comes back to you from far away and seems to express absolutely your most subtle feelings?" "I have felt like that," she answered. "That's why I'm especially fond of the poets," he said. "I think verses are more tender than prose and more apt to make you cry. Yet they're tiresome in the end," Emma said. "These days, what I really adore are stories that can be read all in one go and that frighten you. I detest common heroes and moderate feelings, the sort that exist in real life." There we go, that's the Lydia Davis. Let's give another option with the Geoffrey Wall available in this paperback. "What could be better, really, than an evening by the fire with a book, with the wind beating on the panes, the lamp burning?" "I do so agree," she said, fixing on him her great black eyes open wide. "Your head is empty," he continued. "The hours slip by. From your chair you wander through the countries of your mind, and your thoughts, threading themselves into the fiction, play about with the details or rush along the track of the plot. You melt into the characters. It seems as if your own heart is beating under their skin." "Oh yes, that is true," she said. "Has it ever happened to you," Leon went on, In a book you come across some vague idea you once had, some blurred image from deep down, something that just spells out your finest feelings. I have had that, she answered. That, he said, is why I particularly love the poets. I find verse more tender than prose, and it brings more tears to the eye. Though rather exhausting after a while, Emma went on, and at the moment, you see, I adore stories that push on inexorably, frightening stories. I detest common heroes and temperate feelings the way they are in life. And I'm going to leave it there for today, and I'd like to say a huge thank you for watching. Thank you for discussing Madame Bovary with me. And I would love to know, what is your experience with this novel? Are you embarking upon your first reading? If this is your first reading, then what are you expecting? It's always really interesting to begin a book by noting down your expectations and see what happens when you come to it. Very often these books, they are built up in the public collective consciousness. You have a vague idea of what's going to happen, what they're going to be like, and then it's really interesting to go to them and experience the work for yourself. What are you expecting? What are you looking forward to? What burning question from your life right now would you like to bring to this book? That's a really great thing to do. Bring a burning question to the book, and you will find that deep reading is like deep self-work. It's therapeutic, and it might answer some really important questions, and it might offer you some guidance. If this is a rereading of Madame Bovary for you, when was your first reading? What was your first experience? What did you like and dislike? What did you make of the characters and the themes? And what are you hoping to get out of your rereading? What are you expecting this time around? How long has it been since your last reading? What has happened in your life since then that could change your reaction to the book? Books are mirrors, not just selective mirrors held up to nature, but mirrors held up to ourselves, and they reflect our concerns at a particular moment in time. And if you have taken up the reading assignment at the Hardcore Literature Book Club that I put out recently to do a deep reading on the first chapter and find one thing that leaps out at you, it could be a simile, it could be a character description, it could be a theme, it could be a sentence, it could be anything for any reason. If you did that, then let us know what you found and what you're making of the book thus far. We've got our next reading assignment available in the resources section of this video at patreon.com/hardcore literature. So join us on this adventure and many more adventures to come. And again, thank you so much for watching today. I appreciate you, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Happy reading, and bye-bye for now.